do come together, and we believe that the three aspects of our model really should be based and are based on, they should have one end in mind, that is to improve outcomes. What do we mean by outcomes? Basically, their achievement and their well-being. Now, I just want to show you a model that we're working on how we think this could work in Beaconhouse schools. We know that you do evaluations once a year. We're thinking that there needs to be a slightly more, let's say, comprehensive evaluation that happens perhaps every 3 years, or at a time that you decide is good for you to create a strategic or a long-term plan. The findings from that situational analysis, which is a part of self-review, a kind of self-review, would lead to the development of a strategic plan. And this is something we will need to also build the capacity on. We know that there are some areas where there's good long-term planning. We know that there are some areas where it has only started. We know that there are some areas or some schools where it's not happening. So how do we do that? And it's not, again, I always like to say it's not rocket science. It is really, we need to learn from each other, learn some basic steps and some fundamental principles. And strategic plans mean nothing if they're not implemented through annual planning. And this is where self-review comes in again. We need to have an ongoing self-review. If we're implementing something, how is it going? Have we achieved our targets? Now, this is how our external evaluation can bridge over and basically link in to our system. So what we really want to do is make sure that any external evaluation only supports the self-review. So really what we're saying is, if you take away the self-review, we have nothing. By coming into to your schools and looking at what you're doing, giving you the feedback that perhaps could be useful, but if you really are not engaged in that process and you don't really plan afterwards, then it's a really waste of time and a waste of everybody's time and a lot of anxiety for no reason. Just to share with you what should we review. We'll be emailing you a copy of this presentation, hopefully later on today. So what is it that we should review? This is something for a discussion, but we have been thinking as an evaluation unit about 5 different areas that we could focus on, and one of them is the outcomes. Now, Samia referred to the outcomes and outputs and inputs. Now, we're saying that sometimes when we evaluate the school, we say, okay, how are the teachers teaching? What is the environment like? What about the leaders? How are they leading? What about parents? I mean, what are we doing for parents? But what are schools for? Why are we getting a paycheck at the end of the month? Why are we all working in a school? Students to learn, students to improve. So we want to see students learn, we want to see students engage, we want to see them progress. So how are we actually looking at that? Do we know whether that's happening? What is happening to a student? What's happening to a student, to a secondary student who goes in, has to face, how many lessons do they have a day? 8 periods, okay, 8 lessons, sitting on a hard chair, because most schools have hard chairs. And let's face it, not all teachers are entertaining, so it can be quite a drag sometimes to go through. This is one thing we used to do sometimes as evaluators, actually follow a class. Quite an interesting experience. I would recommend it, especially if the teachers understand why you're doing it. What's happening for the students? What are the experiences they're going through? If we start looking at evaluation through those eyes, rather than saying, what are we doing for them? Start looking at what's happening for them. But obviously, that doesn't happen out of thin air. We have to look at the teaching. We have to look at the leadership. We have to look at the what kind of environment, what kind of values, what kind of social and personal development we're looking at. And I have to say here, what kind of support is being provided by the school group heads? What support is being provided by the school group offices? What support is being provided by the training component of Beaconhouse as well. However, these are only inputs. So we need to look at these things, not just to see whether they are good or not. So what's the point of having a brilliant leader if that leader is not making an impact on student achievement? You can have some very good teachers, but if your teaching is, the learning is not effective, then okay, you might say, but if you have good teachers, there will be good learning. Perhaps there will be, perhaps not necessarily. So whenever we're looking at the 4 qualities, we always have to think about the impact. And this is a good question to have whenever you are dealing with teachers, whenever you are dealing with your SMs, if you like, senior managers in schools, heads of department as well. When you're looking at when you're having conversations with them, ask this question: what is happening? How is this going to impact student achievement? And don't expect a good answer. It's not about getting the answers, but it's about raising the questions. To what extent will this impact? Because you might have a choice. If you're doing budgeting, for example, yesterday we had a session on resourcing, on some leadership strategies, and one of them was about strategic resourcing. Why would we carry out self-review? You have a budget, and hopefully that budget will become even more significant year after year. Now, if you have to allocate that budget, both at school group level, for example, if you have to choose where to allocate resources, how are we going to do that? How are we going to establish the need? How are we going to know where, if we allocate that one, it's going to have maximum input? So we are developing in-detail criteria, which are more like indicators of good practice for each of these areas that could be used in self-review. So this is how eventually the whole model will fit together. Before we come to the discussion questions, I'd really like you to, it's okay, we don't need answers to give Beaconhouse, even if we give them questions. But we have 5, how many groups do we have? Excellent, 5 questions. And we're going to have each group discuss one question, and then we'll shift the papers around. I'll explain the exercise. But it's okay if we actually ask questions rather than just give answers. If we feel that we have the answers, let's give them. Let's be creative. We have 5 questions. The first one is it's more of a sort of challenging one, this one. What have good schools in our system got in common? Because that might lead us to understand what is it that we have, we need to review. So we come from different schools, but many of us have been in a lot of schools. So we really do understand that. The second question is, what should we be reviewing? We don't have a lot of time. What should we focus on? And when should we focus on that? The third question is, what are some of the barriers to effective self-review? And what are the solutions? Why doesn't it happen sometimes? And that's okay, we understand that, because then we can start thinking of solutions. What are the conditions necessary to have open sharing and critique of our work? I really think this is a really important question. I've had some discussions with people, heads and senior managers and school group heads, and I don't know whether this is true, but sometimes in some schools, teachers tend to be a little bit more open. And this links a little bit with what was said, in many of our presentations over the past 2 days, even this morning's presentation, that we need not just to take risks, but we need, before we take risks, there was that teacher who made a really good comment, we need to have an environment where it's okay to take a risk. It's okay to make a mistake. It's okay to say, listen, I'm not doing well in this area. Is that going to affect my appraisal? Is that going to affect the way I'm looked at? Is it okay? And who can model this attitude better than a head or a principal saying, I think I'm not doing so well here. What do you think? If we are going to act as if we don't make mistakes, then the teachers are not going to act as if they make mistakes. And if we don't, and there's another really good thing that was said by Richard Gerver this morning, is that we don't really learn anything when we do things well. So we need to create the conditions whereby it is important to do the mistakes. This is one of the main differences between the Japanese economy in the 80s and 90s and the American economy, where the Japanese economy was very much based on the industry. Japanese, it was very much based on allowing people to make mistakes. They might have 1,000 prototypes, of which 950 would be total failures. But it is through making mistakes that we learn. Let's stop calling them mistakes. Let's call them learning experiences. And the last one is, this is an interesting, maybe I'll be out of a job if we answer this in one direction, but should schools be evaluated externally? And I'd like you to consider, the pros and the cons. I mean, I'm sure that school evaluation, when you've got a group of people coming into your school to eventually make judgments, because that's what it is. We can't sugarcoat it. People are coming in, we're going to look at what you're doing and make judgments. Now, it can be done in a very good way, but still, that is what's happening. That creates anxiety. Also means that in the weeks before the evaluation, we know what happens. We have to make sure our paperwork is in order, that the school is looking good, the teachers are all prepared. So that takes a lot of time, effort, anxiety. Is it worth it? Sorry? So, share these opinions, yeah? Also, however, look at the positive side. Try to look at both sides of the argument. Okay? Could this be useful to the school? How could it be useful to the school? Okay? In what would an external point of view be useful? And remember, external evaluation has its use for two main groups of people. One is the people in the school, and also people who want to have some kind of assurance. People who like the owners of the company and the directors, etc. So what we'd like you to do, we're going to give you a chart for each group, and each group will take one question. We'll put the questions back on the screen, and we'd like you to start discussing that question. Jot down your feedback. Please use any method you want. We will be coming in to